The heat that August came down over the Ossaw Valley like a lid pressed over a pot. And in the center of the dust that hung above the failing town of Dunmore Crossing stood a woman named Iris Kettleman, 41 years old, holding in her two calloused hands the only thing anyone in 3 counties still wanted. Before her, on the cracked earth of the fairground, where the water agent had called the whole valley to gather, waited 100 sunburned faces, and every one of them was turned to her, and every one of them was waiting on her word. She had a length of iron key in her palm, and a spring at her back that had not stopped running in the worst dry any of them had ever known. And the man in the pale linen suit was smiling at her the way a hawk smiles at a field mouse, and the crowd did not breathe. She did not answer him yet. She let the silence stretch, and while it stretched, she thought that the real verdict in this valley had been handed down 2 summers back, not by any of these people and not by any court, but by the land itself, quietly, in a language none of them had bothered to learn. The land remembers what the farmer forgets. An old woman had once told her, and it only whispers, so you must lean close. Iris had leaned close. That was the whole of it. That was all she had ever done. To understand how a woman came to hold a valley in her hand, you have to go back 2 summers. To the spring when Iris Kettleman came into Dunmore Crossing with a wagon, a trunk, and $111 sewn into the hem of her coat, which was the sum total of what was left after her husband died and the bank in the East took the rest. She was a widow without children, and she had learned in the years of her marriage that the world had already made up its mind about a woman alone, and that the mind it had made up was this, that she would fail, and that her failing would be a small tidy thing, and that helping her would be a charity the helper could feel warm about afterward. She had heard the phrase spoken behind her back so many times that it had worn a groove in her. A woman alone said, the way you might say a broken fence or a dry well, a fact to be pitied and worked around. She had stopped arguing with it. She had decided on the long road west that she would answer it, not with words but with time, because time was the one thing she still owned outright. The parcel she bought was 160 acres of bluff and gully at the far northeast edge of the valley, land that 3 families had tried and 3 families had left, land the sellers described in the deed papers as unimproved and undesirable, which was the honest truth. It cost her $60, and the man who sold it to her, a tired clerk acting for a distant estate, kept asking if she understood that there was no working well on it, and that the only water was a seasonal seep at the base of the North Bluff that dried by July. She said she understood. She signed her name in a steady hand. That left her $51, and she spent $20 of it on the day the county sold off the stock of a foreclosed homestead, and what her $22 bought was 45 goats. They were, by every measure the valley kept, worthless. They were a scrub herd, brush goats, half-wild things with ribs, like barrel staves and coats matted with burrs, and they had been penned too long on ground, eaten down to the dirt, so they came to her, starving and suspicious and loud. The auctioneer had tried to sell them as a lot 4 times and gotten no bid at all, because the valley was cattle country and had always been cattle country, and a man measured his worth in head of beef and in the green alfalfa he could coax from irrigated bottomland. Goats were what a poor family kept when it could not afford a cow. 45 goats was not a herd. It was a joke, and the men at the rail made the joke out loud when Iris raised her hand and said $22 in a voice that did not waver, and the auctioneer, half laughing himself, banged his fist on the rail and said, "Sold to the lady!" And the whole yard laughed with him, an easy laughter, not cruel, exactly, just certain. There was a man at that auction who did not laugh, and that was because he was working. His name was Verrill Cade, and he was the land and water agent for the Meridian Cattle and Improvement Consortium, a combine of Eastern money that had spent 5 years buying up the good bottomland of the Ossaw Valley, one failing family at a time. Cade wore pale linen even in the dust and kept his boots clean by never walking where the work was, and he had a warmth about him that people mistook for kindness, until they had done business with him twice. He came to Iris after the sale, touched his hat, and said he was sorry to see a lady saddled with such a burden, and that the consortium, out of neighborly feeling, would take the whole lot of goats off her hands for $15 and consider the land a matter they might discuss later at a fair figure. He said it gently, the way you offer a coat to someone cold. Iris looked at him and at the goats milling in their pen and said, "No, thank you. I believe I'll keep them." Cade smiled and said, "Suit yourself, ma'am, but a woman alone out on that bluff, well," and he let the sentence trail off the way men had been letting it trail off her whole life. And he touched his hat again and walked to his clean buggy, and Iris drove her wagon and her 45 loud starving goats out the northeast road. And the town watched her go and shook its heads, and by supper the story was all over Dunmore Crossing, and it was a good story, the kind that makes a hard place feel briefly superior. The first weeks on the bluff were the arithmetic of survival, and Iris did that arithmetic every night by the light of a single lamp. 45 head, and of those, 11 so weak, she thought she would lose them. A seep that gave a thin dribble in the cool of the morning, and nothing by noon. Not $1 to spare for feed, and no feed to buy if she had it, because the grass on her 160 acres had been eaten to the roots by the families before her, and grew back in nothing but chaparral and thorn, and the tough gray brush the cattlemen called useless scrub. She hauled water in barrels from the town trough, a 2-hour round trip, and it cost her pennies she could not spare, and she watched 2 of the 11 weak ones die anyway in the first 10 days. And she buried them in the hard ground with a shovel that raised blisters on her blistered hands. And on the 10th night she sat on the wagon tongue in the dark and did the arithmetic, and it came out to ruin. 43 head, 160 acres of thorn, $29, and no water past July. She put her face in her hands, and she was as close to broken as she had ever been. It was a small thing that turned her. In the gray of the next morning, going out to the pen with her heart already surrendered, she saw the goats had pushed against the brush along the north gully, and were up on their hind legs, stretching, tearing at the thorny growth she had thought was worthless. Eating the very brush that had defeated 3 families of cattlemen, eating it with a kind of joy. And the 2-day-old kid that had been born to a nanny, too thin to feed it, was on its feet, and butting for milk. The goats were not starving on her land. They were starving in the pen. On the brush, they were feasting. She stood there a long while and watched them work through the thorn, like it was clover, and something turned over in her chest, and she went and opened the pen and let them out onto the whole ruined 160 acres, and she did not sleep that night for watching them. The old woman came in the second week, walking up the northeast road on foot with a basket, which was a strange sight, because nobody walked to Iris Kettleman's place. They only drove past and looked. Her name was Draza Milutin, and she had come to the valley 40 years before, from a mountain country across the ocean whose name most of Dunmore Crossing could not pronounce, and she was old enough that people had stopped being able to guess her age and had settled on ancient. She was respected in the valley and a little feared, because she knew things, and the things she knew had a way of coming true. And she kept goats herself, a small, tidy flock, the only other goats in 3 counties. She set her basket on Iris's step, which held bread and a crock of soft white cheese, and she looked at the goats spread across the thorn, and she said, in her soft accent that turned the words over, like stones in a stream, so, "You are the woman they are laughing at." Iris said she supposed she was. Draza nodded slowly and said, "In my country, we have a saying. The cow eats what pleases her, but the goat eats what the mountain offers. And that is why the goat is still there when the cow has starved." She looked at Iris a long moment. "You did not buy a joke," she said. "You bought the wrong animal for the right land. There is a difference, and it is the whole difference." Then she showed Iris the cheese and how it was made. And she said the milk of a goat that eats mountain brush is not the milk of a valley cow. It carries the herb and the thorn in it. And a person who knows will pay for that, and a person who does not know will laugh, and both of them will be correct according to what they know. She stayed the afternoon and taught Iris to set a simple press, and before she left, she put her old hand flat against a nanny's side and said, "Listen to them, and they will tell you where the water is. They always know before we do." Then she took her basket and walked back down the road, and Iris stood holding a wedge of cheese that tasted of rosemary and wild thyme, though she had planted neither. And she understood for the first time that she had not been given a burden at all. The child came the way stray things come, quietly and by degrees, until one morning he was simply there. His name was Emmett Paul, and he was 9 that summer, the youngest of a hard-luck family down the road whose father drank the little the land gave them, and he had a way of being so still that the goats forgot to be afraid of him. He turned up at the fence one dawn and watched, and the next dawn he was inside it, and by the third he had a burr comb in his hand and was working the mats out of a yearling's coat without being asked. He did not laugh at Iris, because he was too young to have learned that laughing at her was the thing to do. Or perhaps because a boy who is himself laughed at has no laughter to spare for anyone else. He named them all. The big buck with the calm dark eyes and the great swept horns he called Ferdinand, after a picture in a schoolbook. And it fit, because Ferdinand had a dignity to him, a deep stillness. And where Ferdinand went, the flock went, and the flock trusted his judgment more than they trusted Iris's, and Iris came to learn to trust it too. Emmett gave names to the fast ones, and the shy ones, and the greedy ones. And in naming them, he made them individuals to Iris, and in making them individuals, he made her flock into a thing she loved, and the loving of it carried her through the long labor of that first summer the way nothing else could have. They worked, the 3 of them, the woman and the boy, and the old immigrant who came up the road twice a week now, and they did not fight the land. They let the goats teach them the land. The goats told them things. They told them that the thorn along the south fence was richest in the cool hours, and they should be moved there at dawn. They told them, by the way they bunched and complained, when a storm was coming, that the flat sky gave no sign of. And in the driest part of that first July, when the seep at the North Bluff had gone to nothing, and Iris was back to hauling water and doing the terrible arithmetic in her head as she drove, the goats told her the largest thing of all, though it took her weeks to understand what they were saying. It began with Ferdinand. The big buck took to going off from the flock in the heat of the day up the north gully where the brush grew thickest against the base of the bluff, and the others followed him, and Iris noticed the flock coming back in the evening with their bellies full and their thirst not so sharp as it should have been for animals that had not been watered since morning. She thought little of it at first, but she was a woman who had learned to lean close, and one blistering noon in the 3rd week of July she left the barrels and followed them up the gully on foot, pushing through the thorn where the goats had chewed a path. A real path now, a green tunnel worn through the brush by 43 animals passing the same way day after day. And she followed that path a 1/4 mile up the narrowing gully to where it ended against the sheer red rock of the bluff. And there she stopped, and she stood very still, because the goats were gathered in a shaded cleft in the rock, and they were drinking. Water came out of the base of the bluff. Not a seep, not a dribble that would fail by August, but a true spring, cold and steady, welling up out of a fissure in the red rock into a basin the goats had worn smooth with their own hooves and mouths over the weeks of coming here, and running off in a thin bright thread down through the thorn before it sank back into the dry gravel of the gully and vanished. The reason no one had ever found it was the reason no one ever finds anything in a place like that. The mouth of the spring had been buried under a mat of the very thorn brush the cattlemen despised, a tangle so thick and so useless that 3 families had never once fought their way up that gully, having no reason to. And the brush had grown over the water like a lid, and the water had run on underneath in the dark, patient. For how many years no one would ever know. It had taken an animal that ate thorn to open the door. The goats had chewed a path to a bluff spring that never quit, and they had done it, not as a favor to Iris, but simply by being what they were, And Draza's words came back to her standing there in the cool of the cleft with the water running over her fingers. Listen to them, and they will tell you where the water is. They always know before we do. She banked it. That was her word for it, in the private ledger of her mind. She banked the spring the way you bank a coal at night, raking the ash over it low, so it will not show and will not go out, keeping the heat of it hidden until it is needed. She told no one, but Emmett and Draza, and she swore them both to silence. And Emmett, who understood better than any of them what it was to have a thing worth guarding, kept the secret like it was his own life. Iris cleared just enough of the thorn to reach the water and no more, leaving the natural screen of brush across the gully mouth so that from the road and from the flat you would never guess anything grew there but chaparral and thorn. She dug a small stone catch basin below the spring, lined it with clay. Draza showed her how to find, and led the overflow into it, so that she had a standing pool of clean cold water her flock could reach, without her hauling a single barrel. She kept driving her wagon to town for water twice a week. Even so, empty barrels rattling, so the town would go on seeing what it expected to see. A woman alone struggling out on a dry bluff with a herd of worthless goats. Being pitied, she found, was a kind of cover, and she wore it like a coat. Being right, Draza told her, is its own kind of reply, and it does not need to be shouted, it only needs to be true and to wait. The waiting turned to profit slowly, the way the season turns, so that no one day was different from the one before it, and yet by autumn everything had changed. On the mountain brush and the cold spring water, her flock did not just survive, it flourished, and the milk came rich and abundant, and Iris made cheese by Draza's old country method. Wheels of it pressed and salted and aged in the cool of the cleft by the spring where the temperature held even in the heat. And the cheese carried the wild herb of the thorn in it, the thyme and the sage and the bitter greens the cattle would not touch. And it was, though Iris had no word for it then, extraordinary. She sold none of it in Dunmore Crossing, because Dunmore Crossing would not have known what it was holding and would have paid a poor family's price for a poor family's food. She waited for the outside validator, and he came in the person of a man named Silas Ongo, the head cook of the rail company's hotel over the mountains, at the division point, a heavy, careful man with a palate trained in the eastern cities, who had come out looking for cream and eggs from the valley farms, and who tasted a wedge of Iris's cheese that Draza had carried to a market day, and who stopped chewing and closed his eyes and asked, very quietly, "Who made this?" Silas Ongo drove out to the bluff himself. He tasted the cheese at the source, and he looked at the goats on the thorn, and he did the arithmetic that no one in the valley had thought to do, and he offered Iris a standing contract for every wheel she could make, at a price per pound that made her sit down on the wagon tongue when he had gone. It was 4 times what the best valley butter fetched. He came back every 3 weeks after that with his wagon, and he paid in silver, and the silver went into a strongbox under the floor of Iris's cabin, and the town of Dunmore Crossing, driving past on the northeast road, saw a woman alone hauling empty barrels to town for water, and pitied her, and never once wondered what a rail hotel cook was doing, turning his wagon up that useless road. And Iris let them not wonder. She kept banking the coal. She grew her flock careful and slow, keeping the best dwellings, until 43 head became 60, and 60 became 81 by the second summer, and every one of them fat on thorn and watered from a spring the valley did not know existed. And Iris Kettleman, the joke of Dunmore Crossing, had more hard silver under her floor than any 3 cattlemen in the county, and not a soul alive, but a boy, an old woman, and a hotel cook had the least idea. Beryl Cade did not forget her. Men like Cade do not forget a piece of land they have marked, and he had marked the northeast bluff long ago, not for its brush, but for its position, because the Meridian Consortium's grand design was a great irrigation canal to run the length of the valley. And the survey line the Eastern engineers had drawn ran straight across the base of Iris Kettleman's North Bluff. The consortium needed her 160 acres, or at least the bluff of it, and Kate had assumed, as everyone had assumed, that a woman alone would fold within a year and sell for whatever charity the consortium chose to call fair. When she did not fold, when the second summer came and she was still there, he began to press, and he pressed in 3 tightening waves, the way such men always do. The first wave was money, dressed as friendship. Kate drove out in his clean buggy and admired the view and mentioned over a cup of Iris's coffee that he did not drink, that the consortium had authorized him to offer a truly generous figure for the parcel, $200, more than triple what she had paid. And he said it as though he were doing her a kindness she was too simple to appreciate. Iris said the land was not for sale. Kate's warmth did not flicker, but something behind his eyes took a small measurement of her, and he touched his hat and said he'd be back when she'd had time to be sensible. The second wave was rumor, and rumor is cheaper than money, and often does more work. Word went around Dunmore Crossing that the Kettleman goats carried a sickness, that scrub goats fouled the range and spread a rot to cattle, that a woman who did not know enough to run cattle on cattle land was a danger to her neighbors, and though there was not one true word in it, it took, because the valley wanted a reason to feel about Iris the way it already felt, and rumor gave it one, dressed as concern. A committee of men came out to look at her flock for signs of the rot, and found 81 of the healthiest goats any of them had ever grudgingly laid eyes on, and went away grumbling, and the rumor thinned but did not die. The third wave came with the drought, and the drought came like the open door of a furnace. The second summer had been dry, but the third was a killing dry, the worst in the memory of the oldest settlers, a dry that came down in April and did not lift, so that by June the valley grass was gone and the alfalfa burned in the fields, and the Oso River that fed every ditch and trough in the country shrank to a string of warm stagnant pools. And then, to crack mud and the cattle, the whole valley measured its worth in, began to die. They died in the bottomlands where the good grass had been. They died at the dry troughs, with their heads down. And the cattlemen who had laughed at Iris Kettleman 2 summers back stood in their scorched fields and watched their fortunes rot in the sun. And the arithmetic that had once been Iris's alone became the whole valley's arithmetic now. And it came out, for all of them, to ruin. The consortium's great canal was a dry ditch. Useless, because a canal with no river to fill it is only a longer way for water to not be. And the springs of the valley, the few there were, failed one after another as the water table dropped, until there was talk that Dunmore Crossing itself would have to be abandoned, that a whole valley of people would have to load their wagons and go, because you cannot argue with a dry country, you can only leave it. And through all of it, up on the northeast bluff, hidden behind its screen of thorn that the drought could not kill, because the goats kept it grazed and the roots ran deep, a spring welled cold and steady out of the red rock and never quit, watering 81 fat goats and a woman and a boy, and twice a week, an old immigrant woman's small tidy flock that Iris had quietly told the secret to at last, because Draza was family now and had been for a long time. The first of the humbled beggars was the loudest of the old mockers. His name was Boone Halloran, and he had led the laughter at the auction 2 summers back, a big prosperous cattleman with 300 head and a booming voice, and the drought had ruined him worst of all because he had leveraged the most. And one evening in July he drove up the northeast road with his hat in his hands, which no man who owns 300 cattle ever does, and he stood in Iris's yard and could not for a long moment make himself speak. His cattle were dying, he said finally. He had heard, there was talk, that she had water up here, and he had children, and he did not have the money to pay what water was surely worth in a dry like this. And he had come to ask, and he knew he had no right to ask, and he stood there in the ruin of his pride, waiting to be sent away. And Iris looked at the man who had laughed the loudest, and she thought about the arithmetic of it, how she could name any price she liked, and he would have to pay it or watch his children go hungry. how the whole valley would have to pay it, how she was, at this moment, the richest and most powerful person in the Ossaw Valley, and every soul in it was about to learn her name in earnest. She told Boone Halloran to bring his water barrels up in the morning, and to bring his children, and that they would talk about payment later, and the big man wept in her yard, and that was the beginning of the reckoning. Water the spring could not be banked any longer, and Iris did not try to bank it. It ran through the valley like the water it was, and within a week her yard was a road of wagons, and she gave water to everyone that came, and she did not ask a soul for a coin, because she had learned 2 summers back the difference between a person who is desperate and a person who is your neighbor, and the difference is only whether you decide to see it. But Verrill Cade heard too, and Cade did not see a neighbor, he saw a resource. And a resource in a dry country is the only kind of gold that matters, and he moved to take it the only way he knew, which was to own it. He came to Iris, with the consortium's authority in his pocket and a new offer that was no offer at all, $1,200 for the parcel and the water rights both. A fortune said in his false warm voice, more than she could dream. And when she said no, he let the warmth fall away at last and showed her what had always been underneath it. And he told her the consortium held the paper on half the failed farms in the valley and could make things very hard for a woman alone, and that the county recorder was a friend of the consortium's, and that water rights in a drought were a matter the courts took a great interest in, and that a spring on a parcel, bought for $60 by an eastern widow, with no standing in the valley, was a thing that could be tied up in law until the widow starved or sold, whichever came first, and he said it all in the flat, pleasant voice of a man who has never once lost. Then he made his mistake. The mistake such men always make, born of the contempt that had made him underestimate her from the first day. He tipped his hand. He told her to prove the consortium's reach, exactly how many wheels of cheese she had sold Silas Ongo over the winter, and the figure was precise, too precise, a number only a man who had been watching her, counting her wagons, questioning the hotel cook, spying on her the whole long while, could possibly have known. And Iris Kettleman looked at Verrill Cade and understood that he had been at her since the beginning, that the rumor of the rot had been his, that the whole slow, patient war had been his, and she said nothing, but she banked that too, low under the ash, for one more day. The reckoning came at the fairground. In the second week of August, when the water agent, which is what Cade had gotten himself, named by the desperate county board, called the whole valley together to settle the water question, and stood up on a wagon bed in his pale linen suit and told the 100 sunburned families that the Meridian Consortium had generously agreed to purchase the Northeast Spring and administer its water fairly, for a reasonable fee to all in need, and that Mrs. Kettleman had wisely agreed to sell. And he turned to Iris, standing below him, and held out his hand for the answer he was certain of, and the crowd held its breath. And this is where we began, with the heat coming down like a lid in the iron key of the spring's clay cistern, and Iris Kettleman's calloused palm, and 100 faces turned to her, and every one of them waiting on her. She did not take his hand. She stepped up onto the wagon bed beside him, so that the whole valley could hear her quiet voice, and she said, "I have not agreed to sell, and I do not intend to sell, not to this man, and not to his consortium, not for $1,200, and not for $12,000. She let that settle. Then she said, "This man tells you he will administer my water fairly for a reasonable fee, and I will tell you what his reasonable fee will be, because I have heard his offers, and I will tell you something else." She turned to Cade. "You told me 3 days ago the exact number of cheese wheels I sold over the mountain this winter. Now, how would the water agent know a thing like that, a thing I never told a living soul, unless he had been counting my wagons and buying answers out of a hotel cook and watching a woman alone from the day she outbid him on 45 starving goats he wanted for himself?" The crowd stirred, and Cade's face did the thing that faces do when the ground shifts under a man, and he began to speak and found there was nothing to say that would not dig the hole deeper. And the valley, which had wanted a reason to think ill of Iris 2 summers back, found instead a reason to think ill of him. And it turned on him all at once, the way a flock turns, following the buck they trust. And then Iris did the thing that took the last of Cade's power away, because you cannot fight a person who wants nothing from you. She said, "The water is not for sale, but it is not mine to hoard either, because I did not make it. My goats found it, and God or the mountain put it there long before any of us came, and it never quit, not once, in the worst dry this valley has ever seen." She said, "I will not charge you for the water. I will only ask that those who are able send a hand up to help me dig the ditches and lay the pipe to bring it down to a public trough at the crossroads, because water wants to be carried, and carrying is work, and I will take my payment in the labor and in nothing else." She said, "That is the whole of my price. It is fair pay for a fair day, and the water on top of it is a gift, because that is what water is, and that is what neighbors are. And I have been in this valley 2 summers, and I would like, if you will have me, to stay." For a moment nobody moved, and then Boone Halloran, the big cattleman who had laughed the loudest and wept in her yard, took off his hat, and beside him another man took off his, and then it went through the crowd like wind through grass, 100 hats coming off under the killing sun, and it was the quietest sound Iris had ever heard, and the loudest. And Verrill Cade stood on the wagon bed, in his pale, clean suit in the middle of it, forgotten, his warmth gone, and his threats gone, and his consortium's $1,200 gone worthless, defeated not by a lawyer or a gun, but by a woman who would not sell what she chose to give away. And he climbed down off the wagon and got into his buggy and drove out of the valley, and no one watched him go, because they were all watching Iris. The rains came in the 3rd week of September, the way they always come in the end, sudden and generous over ground too hard at first to take them, and then softening, and the Oso River ran again, and the grass came green out of the cracked bottomland faster than anyone believed it could, and the valley healed. But it did not forget. The ditch got dug that autumn by 50 men who came up the northeast road that had never come before, and the public trough ran cold and clean at the crossroads through that winter and every dry season after, and Iris Kettleman was not the joke of Dunmore Crossing anymore, and was not a woman alone anymore in the way they had meant it, but a fixture. A name spoken with the particular respect a hard country keeps for those who have proven out. She married no one and needed no one. Emmett Paul came to live on the Bluff when his father drifted off for good, and grew up her son in all but paper, and learned the goats and the cheese and the spring, and Silas Ongo's wagon still turned up the road every 3 weeks. And Rosamond Luton came up one bright cold morning, that first autumn of the rains, with her basket of bread, and she stood beside Iris at the fence and watched old Ferdinand, gray now around his calm dark eyes, lead the flock up the green path they had chewed to the spring that never quit. In her voice that turned to words over, like stones in a stream, "I told you. The land remembers what the farmer forgets, and it only whispers." She patted Iris's calloused hand with her ancient one. "You leaned close," she said. "That is the whole of it. That is all anyone must ever do." And down in the cleft in the red rock the water welled up, cold and steady out of the dark, where it had run patient and unknown for 100 years, waiting, the way the truth waits, for someone with the humility to follow a goat up a gully, and the wisdom to give away what she was never given the right to keep. And Iris Kettleman stood in the sun on the land that was hers, and watched her flock go down to drink, and she was at last home. Well.
C'est pas Twitch qui te fera vivre, clairement pas. On avait cette conversation-là hier, c'est très marrant. C'est pas Twitch qui te fera vivre tout seul. Au-delà de, même si tu cartonnes et que tu as plein de subs, parce que on va pas se mentir, hein. Les subs, c'est quand vous lâchez votre sub, c'est un petit peu d'argent pour le streamer. C'est pas, il y aura pas que ça, ce sera pas possible. Il faut se développer sur tous les autres réseaux, déjà. Il faut que tes autres réseaux, que ce soit TikTok, YouTube, Insta, il faut que ça soit ta vitrine. C'est-à-dire qu'il faut que tu fasses de la pub constamment. Tu vois, c'est comme un catalogue. Il faut toujours que tu postes, que tu fasses de la pub sur les autres réseaux. pour te faire ramener du monde sur Twitch, bien évidemment. Après, tu peux avoir aussi la rémunération sur TikTok à un moment ou un autre. Moi, je l'ai pas. Heu et après en fait, comment t'expliquer? Il va falloir aller chercher du partenariat, mais pour aller chercher du partenariat avec des marques, et ben, il faut que tu aies un petit peu de monde sur tes streams, sinon tu es pas légitime. C'est très, très